Hey, everyone, thanks for being here. Greg Greene here with the Laird Barron subreddit, and this is our webcast wrapping up the great Laird Barron Read-Along of 2024, where we've covered Laird's short story collections and his novel, The Croning, up to his latest, which is, of course, Not a Speck of Light, which, I'm super excited to have. Not only Laird is here on the call, but Doug Murano, his publisher at Bad Hand Books, and also the illustrator of this collection, Trevor Henderson. You may know him better on social media as Slimy Swamp Ghost, but Trevor Henderson is his name. He is a legendary horror illustrator, is really the only way to say it. I think it's the only fair way to put it. But we're thrilled to have all of you guys, and of course Edward Meehan, my co-host, is here with us as well. So great to have you guys on. Really excited for this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
How's everyone doing? Laird, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm dealing with just full disclosure. I'm dealing with an eye issue. So it's basically just part of everything that happened to me a couple of years ago. There's lots of comorbidities, I guess they would say, and one of them happens to be my eye. I can't really see out of it very well, so bear with me there. But I'm really happy to be here, and I just want to say at the outset I appreciate you and Ed and everybody else that has worked really hard on the Laird Barron Reddit subreddit. Number one, that's becoming a bigger and bigger thing, but just this read along this last year has been extraordinary. I hope it gets collected somewhere because it's some really great write-ups and thoughtful commentary. I'm really, I guess, blessed to have such a active and supportive group of fans and colleagues that have taken part in this.
I just kind of the guy who helped orchestrate the read-along with Edward. Edward's been my right-hand man, and just the enthusiasm from our contributors and just the Redditors who were there reading along and adding comments. It's added. I've read all of your fiction, but oh my gosh, it's added so much insight to my understanding of your stories. And that's it. It's like, how do you get a tribe together who's global, where their readers are all over the world for your work? How do you get them together to talk through it? And Reddit's a pretty good way to do it. But the read along really I've just been blown away by the depth of the insights. So yeah, we need to think about collecting that. That would be a super cool kind of reader's companion, I think.
Oh yeah.
Well, For this time, we're gonna definitely limit it to 90 minutes. I'm usually not very good at keeping time like that, but I'm going to do a much better job this time. Folks who are watching, please put your comments in the over on YouTube Live. I already see some folks saying hi and testing comments. We will ask as many of your questions as we can, ask as many of your questions to our guests as we can. If it is about a specific story and not a speck of light, go ahead and let us know which story you're referring to. And then, I guess I wanted to start by just saying that the accolades for Not a Speck of Light have been pretty darn incredible. Reviewed very favorably in the New York Times, NPR, Paste Magazine, Esquire. Edward found a quote in Reddit, not even in the Laird Barron subreddit, I don't think, but I'll put this up here. Edward, you wanna narrate this for us real quick?
Yeah, I just encountered Matthew M. Bartlett in the wild because we were talking about Gabino Iglesias being such a big fan of Laird's new collection and just in general. And what Matthew said is he's probably the best writer in the genre. So I asked him if I could share that, and he said yes. So,
and Matthew's a well-regarded author in his own right, but I think he's onto something there. So. I did want to start by asking Doug. You have some history with Laird in publishing his work. I think the first thing you published of his was Ode to Jode the Toad in Miscreations, which I have right here, and it's got one of my favorite covers by Hag Cult. This is just awesome. The whole collection's really terrific. But Ode to Joe the Toad, and then of course Hag Cult come back with another cover here. The Wind Began to Howl. So started with a short story, went to a novella, and then of course the short story collection. I mean, that is, of course, we're seeing an increasing investment in your interest in his work, and a short story collection is not a small investment there. What is it about Laird's work that resonates with you?
Well, I first really fell in love with Laird's work on my way out to the World Horror Convention in Portland. Gosh, it must have been almost a decade ago now. And I read The Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All on the flight and the layovers. And it was, Greg and Edward, I think you probably remember some of your earliest experiences with Laird's work. It just kind of changes you. It was cosmically weird and accessible at the same time in a way that I just hadn't quite encountered to that moment. I was a young editor. I was still feeling my way around the corners of the genre, and Laird's work just blew my mind. There was a muscular aspect to it, but also an incredible emotional sensitivity that would seem paradoxical in a lesser writer's hands, but Laird pulls it off very, very well. And it was, I think, that dichotomy that really drew me to his work. And it provides a depth beyond what a lot of other writers working in the cosmic horror space provide. There's a real emotional core that I think Laird gets to in a way that that frankly not many do, working in any sort of corner of the genre, but Laird in particular, the melding of that with cosmic horror, which is historically very much at an emotional distance, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That is what really struck me. And so I started out like a lot of the folks who've gone on to work with Laird, as just a fan. I went out and kind of had my first debutante experience at a World Horror Convention, and reread it again on the way back to South Dakota. And then it was a few years later, actually, our publishing history. And I don't know if very many folks know about this, because I don't think very many folks ended up reading this volume, unfortunately. But the first time I ever worked with Laird was he did the foreword for Shadows Over Main Street Volume 2 with D. Alexander Ward. And that experience, that reading experience, directly influenced my desire to want to work with him in that way. And so I kind of felt like I had to get my foot in the door there. But then, of course, you're right. Several years later, we went on to Michael Bailey and I went on to publish Miscreations through his imprint, Written Backwards. And I don't want to go on too long, because I could speak about this for a long, long time. But as an anthologist, I always love to have like an oddball story in the mix. One that definitely checks the box in terms of this is what the anthology is about, but one that just feels weird. It's like that track near the end of an album of rock music that's just sort of like, okay, we're stretching a little bit and it's fun. And that was this story. And a lot of folks who read the anthology picked it out because of that. And it was great fun in the antiquity setting, just completely psychedelic, and provided a really nice contrast to some of the more straightforward dark fare in that anthology. Frankly, I really liked the leavening effect that it had on the entire book. So we loved working with him in that regard. And then, long story short, when I started up Bad Hand Books 2.5 years ago, after working in the genre for about a decade, Laird was one of the first people that I thought about, because the sort of mission statement of Bad Hand Books is we wanted to do horror, crime, and dark fantasy, and Laird melds those things in a way that, again, very few authors can pull off. And I thought, well, if I reach out to Laird, he will certainly be able to provide one or more of those things simultaneously. And as a young publisher, it certainly has been a boon to have someone of Laird's reputation and talent on board. Again, we're just a baby publisher at Bad Hand Books, and to have this sort of talented, tremendously influential author in our lineup at this early stage is just phenomenal. And I've really enjoyed working with him.
And you know, Bad Hand, you refer to it as a baby publisher, but you guys really have set a very high bar already. I mean, I know Laird on his, I think on every call we've had with him during the read along, has just talked about how much. I mean, well, Laird, I don't want to put any words in your mouth. What's it been like working with Bad Hand?
Well, I attribute the success of Not a Speck of Light to the company I keep as much as anything else. And I've been very fortunate with most of my releases, my major releases. I've been with really great people, and this was an exceptional, you know, even more exceptional in a lot of ways. And you know, Doug didn't just go out and grab up, you know, somebody that he could afford or that was convenient. He went out and sought one of the hottest artists out there, and you know, somebody with a great reputation that's growing every day. And then Todd Kiesling, you know, did the layout, and Todd is, you know, becoming renowned for that in the field on top of his own writing. So I feel very taken care of, I guess I would say, by this publisher. And you know, the words have to stand on their own, but you will do, you'll get a lot farther if you have really, really talented people that care about what they're doing, complementing your efforts with the layout, with the cover, and with basically the dedication to trying, you know, as a small press, to get it seen by people and reviewed by, you know, by good publications. So that's what it's been like for me.
Awesome. And Doug, the public response, and of course, you know what I mentioned. You know, it's been reviewed by, you know, New York Times and NPR, et cetera. Very high profile sources for reviews. But as a publisher, what's the response been like to Not a Speck of Light? Is it what you expected?
Oh my gosh. You know, having been, you know, one of the first to read the collection, I knew that I had something special on my hands. And I kept on telling people who were very close to my inner circle, my family, very close friends. My wife had to hear this from me for months and months, but I just kept saying things are going to be different in September. I don't know what it's going to look like, but things are going to look different. There's going to be before this collection
Wow.
with Bad
Yes.
Hand books, and then there's going to be after. And
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what, but it's going to be different. And that has come true in ways that honestly I could not imagine. About, you know, a month, 3 months, 4 months before it came out, I was getting requests from some of the larger publications that ended up reviewing it. And so I kind of had an inkling that we were on our way somewhere interesting from a
Yes.
public relations standpoint. I certainly wasn't worried about the quality of it. I thought readers are going to find this and they're going to love it. The coverage aspect of it has been a ride, and one that has been a lot of fun. And again, I give all the credit to my creative partners on that. Laird provided just a stunning collection that provides enough of what his readers have come to expect, but also challenges them in ways that have got them talking. So that's part of it, just having the readership talking. Trevor's artwork and Trevor's platform have gotten this book in front of tens of thousands of eyes that maybe would not have known about it through no fault of Laird's, but my reach as a small publisher isn't everything that I wish it would be. And so to have a talent like Trevor on board, who's able to help me, not only from a visual standpoint, but from a marketing standpoint, just get the word out, has been tremendous. And so it's been really fun to see all the different parts of this come together and work the way that they have.
I want to ask Trevor a little bit about his illustration work, and there's a question in the comments. I want to come back to you about that, Doug, asking about the kind of the risk you're taking on by creating your own indie publisher. But Trevor, let me jump over to you, and I'm also going to bring up some of the artwork from the book here. Here we go. That cover, of course, that gorgeous and cover. It was funny when Doug revealed that, because it's like, here's the cover. Take a little bit closer look, and folks did, and you can see on socials, the media is like, oh my gosh, there's like this stuff, and there are things looking out there looking at you. I looked at the book looked at me. But some of these other images, like these kind of just I love this one's from the very last story, You Won't Be Saved by the Ghost of Your Old Dog. It has that kind of ancient Greek theater mask look to it, and other pieces. Just tell us about of course the creature from Tiptoe. Tell us about the approach you took to this, because it does look like Trevor Henderson, like a Trevor Henderson piece here, but there's also a very distinct style just for this collection that is phenomenal.
Yeah, well, I do feel like when I take on a bigger project like this project, I want to have the kind of textures all the way through, so they look of a piece, and really feel all in one. So this was, I think, 2 or 3 different brushes that I stuck to for the whole thing, just so I could get that kind of soft, gauzy sort of look. But just the whole project was a dream, and also I was just so intimidated because when I was getting into like prose horror fiction, like actually really seriously getting into it, Laird's work was like fundamental stuff, and I've been a fan forever. So I felt like taking my life in my hands when I started this project, especially illustrating stories like In a Cavern in a Canyon, like this one here, and which is a story I've loved forever. And then also having to getting to and also having to portray the monster in Tiptoe, which I think is one of the finest horror stories ever written. I was like, to sum it up, I guess it was just a huge mix of excitement and nerves, and trying to do justice to the stories, which are all resoundingly excellent, and also bring some of my own stuff and the kind of stuff that people like in my illustration work, especially the this kind of like soft charcoal black and white work I sometimes do, but through the lens of these stories, I guess.
I'd love to hear, Laird, what was your reaction when you started seeing some of these depictions of the creatures and threats and characters in your work?
I knew before I saw a sketch that I was really fortunate, because I follow Trevor for years now. I mean, probably since the earlier Facebook days, and so I knew that the book would be in excellent hands. I was ecstatic when I heard that he agreed to take it on, and when I started seeing the illustrations, I was thrilled. This is, I think this is another reason why the book has been successful with the critics, for example, and a lot of the fans who've read it. It's just of a piece, the cover, right? The cover illustration, but then the layout for it, the layout inside, and the illustrations all meld in a way that it feels really, the art direction's really good. Not just the art, but the art direction, the whole aesthetic of it combined. And
I wanted to say also that I couldn't a big part of this is Doug helping out, providing art direction. The idea for the cover was Doug's, and his help was intrinsic to making everything kind of come together as a cohesive whole, I think.
I appreciate that. I remember when Laird and I first started speaking about this collection, we knew that we wanted something dark, and the idea that Laird and I kind of started to bat back and forth was this thing that you look at, and I'll use the word rewards you. It rewards you the longer you stare at it. And that's exactly what Trevor delivered. It just like it becomes more unnerving. It looks kind of like a dark forest texture at a glance, and then you realize that the abyss is staring back at you. And I have to really give a tip of the cap to Trevor. When we first started trading notes on illustrations, he had a sketch, he had a drawing for the help me monster, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was Trevor, and Trevor himself kind of paused and was like, this isn't exactly where I want to go with this. And when you came back, it was with the style that carried through the rest of the book. It was like you went back and you kind of reconfigured the Help Me Monsters sketch, and then it was like you had the tiger by the tail after that. You knew where you wanted to go, and it was like everything just kind of flowed out of there. And not a lot of artists that I've worked with, and I understand why this is, time is money, right? Have stopped and have said, I personally would like to push this farther. And I really appreciated that about you and your work ethic and your eye for excellence on this. Is just it told me everything I needed to know about working with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it ties back into especially that story, which is the one I think the first one we started with for the interiors. I love that story so much. I think it's so scary, and it delivers the scares through like an antagonist that's so ambiguous, and also like I just love any monster that tackles mimicry, like hunts people through mimicry. So I just really love that story, and I really want to like put my best foot forward with it. So it was the right move to pull the other one, and then kind of like reassess a little bit, and yeah, I found the brush that I used for like 70-80% of these drawings through that one drawing, redoing it. So it was a good thing that happened, and I'm glad I paused a little bit on it.
Yeah, it was cool. And I don't have an artistic vocabulary, but I love the feeling that you captured that is in every one of these stories. It's you go into a dark room and you turn a flashlight on for a millisecond, and this is what you see. Yeah, it just feels like each one of the drawings is the nightmare that's waiting for you in the dark, and you just get a millisecond of it, and it's enough to just completely turn your hair white. And I love the aesthetic of it. I have not had a chance to just tell you, Trevor, so this is a selfish moment for me, but I absolutely love it.
Thank you. I love lighting stuff by flashlight. I do that in a lot of my art. I think it's inherently very scary to me, and just kind of like, and also you can really play with shadow in a really interesting way a lot of the time. And that heavy big shadow behind an object you get when it's a direct source of light, it's always really effective in like kind of grounding the scene, both in this style and like more fully fleshed out like color painting work, that kind of thing. So I kind of will try and do that flashlight lighting as often as I possibly can, because I love it.
And it kind of subverts the title of the collection a little bit, because it's like not a speck of light on its face sounds like the threat, but you get a speck of light and you might not like what you see, right?
Yeah. And it's funny too, because I remember when we did the cover, which it's as close as you can get in an image to being completely free of any light. I was like, this does need to be printed. So you might have to try this a few more times just to make sure it's discernible. And I was so relieved when we saw the physical printing of the cover that it came out right and it came out nice. Because I've had bad experiences in the past where I'll work really hard with the contrasts and the levels of light, and then it'll come out too dark and you lose a lot. So it was I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw it.
Same. I remember I kept pushing you to make it darker, and we originally had white eyeballs in some of the beasts, and I was like, we gotta do away with those. And to your credit, or my insanity, we went there. It turned out so
it was the right move. Yeah.
It's the as you described it, Trevor, the gauziness of this of so much of this work, and this is the image from Girls Without Their Faces On, which is just horrific. I mean, it takes me back to the feeling I got looking at pictures from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Is it Steve Trammell? Is that the? I think he's
Stephen Gamel's the illustrator. The folklorist writer is Alvin Schwartz.
That's it.
Yeah, but yeah, Stephen Gamel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But it just kind of has that there's that kind of effect on me. I also don't have the artistic language to be able to explain why. But the gauziness also reminds me of Laird's approach to many of his stories, which is in particular, I think about Jorn Falls and American remake of a Japanese ghost story, where their art of subtlety is very much in play. I know we've talked in the past about T.E.D. Klein's story Petey, which is a kind of a dinner party, and there's something going on, and it's not revealed. It's really not exactly ever revealed what happens, but it's not plainly revealed until the very last line, I think, that there is a real threat going on. But if you go back and read through it, you start to catch some of those clues. And I love seeing that, especially in again, a story like Jorn Falls. The art of subtlety is there, and there's a feeling of dismay, or something's extremely wrong here. I just don't know why. And to me, while your images are so they're absolutely distressing and frightening, there is still that layer of gauziness to it that I think kind of plays into the subtlety with which Laird approaches some of his stories. Trevor or Laird, do you guys have any reaction to that? Am I on the right track there?
I mean, I tried to do that specifically because I felt it would be a disservice to kind of nail down what's kept kind of, purposefully submerged in darkness and ambiguity in the stories. I feel like it would be, to lay it out would be kind of cheating the reader and the writing, maybe. I don't know.
Yes.
Well, that's I thought that one of the reasons that the illustrations work so well is because it seems to match what a lot of the stories attempt to do. They're kind of slippery. On one hand, there's a concrete image if you read it on one level, and it's it's a typical story. Most of them, 3 to 5 act structures that resolve. But there's an ambiguity to a lot of them, and the artwork works because it's the same. There's a clear delineated image that there's a face, there's a person, there's a crowd, that kind of a dog. But it's upon further inspection you realize just there's all this other stuff going on, textured, layered in, and some of it's incomplete almost, or ambiguous. And I thought that really it kind of serves the duality. It kind of balances them, that there's this realist kind of component of my stories and the art, but then there's the surreality or the fuzziness where it breaks down at the margins. And I think that that just worked to perfection.
Thank you. That makes me really happy to hear, because it's specifically what I was going for.
Nice. That's awesome. Chicken Dragon, who's one of our main contributors on the read-along.
Awesome.
His write-ups have been so good. I've been just thrilled with that. He had a question for Trevor. He says, "What's the story you'd love to illustrate if given the chance?" And that could be one of Laird's. I clarified with him. It could be one of Laird's stories. Could be another author. Anything that's just always been kind of that quest story that you'd love to do illustrations for.
Well, right off the top of my head, if I was going to illustrate another Laird story, it would be I would illustrate anything because I love his writing. But the one that I was fixated on before I read in a Cavern in a Canyon was Blackwood's Baby, and I love the monster in Blackwood's Baby. I would love to do a rendition of that. But just generally, I'm reading T.E.D. Klein right now, and we just brought up T.E.D. Klein. So anything in Dark Gods, I would love to take a crack at. Maybe Children of the Kingdom, honestly, because the creatures in that are great.
Yes, absolutely. And then jumping back to Doug, Chicken Dragon also has a question. What made you want to split away, make your own publishing company? Seems like a big risk in a volatile industry. How did you feel comfortable taking that risk? And we could probably take the whole rest of this webcast for you to answer it, but how would you try to sum that up? Because we were talking right beforehand, before we went live, with my admiration for you for kind of taking that risk, you know, as a guy who's got a family, and then now you're building a reputation with a young publishing company. Tell us about how you made that decision.
So I'll start with the end. With the end at the beginning, you don't get comfortable with it. That's part of the fun. I know that sounds crazy, but I like that feeling of you know, jumping for the trapeze and not knowing if it's going to be there. After a while, you just get hooked on it, and I think that's where I am right now. Who knows what'll happen? But what made me want to do it was I'd worked with other publishers over the past 10 years or so, mostly with Crystal Lake Publishing, who are great. But I found myself taking on a lot of the art direction and contracts and marketing, and doing a lot of the types of things that I knew would be involved with running a small independent press. And so that was sort of my training ground. And, you know, I like to be in charge. So that's the simplest way I can put it. I built up kind of a Rolodex of authors. My personality is such that I like things done a certain way. And I felt like I could do it. And there comes a point in your life where you need to know. I suspected that I could do it, but you need to know at some point. And I don't think I could have. I don't want to sound too melodramatic, but I didn't want to go to my grave not knowing. And that was sort of one of the things that just kept bothering me, was thinking, I know I can do this. The other part of it was that in 2018, I experienced kind of a career collapse. I was laid off at my job, and I started making a joke to myself during my long nights of the unemployed, because I didn't have a backup plan at that point, realizing that it would be maybe good for me to have something of my own. And it was a joke I kept telling to myself in those dark nights. I would say to myself, you can do a lot with a bad hand, because I had felt like I'd been dealt a bad hand. And it occurred to me that it was one of those kind of crazy, depressed jokes where I'd say, if I ever get the chance to make my own company, I'm going to call it Bad Hand Books, because I want to turn my bad hand into kind of a middle finger and ride out into battle under that. And so it was sort of born out of really, really dark, awful jokes I would tell to myself, and also sort of with a longer arc of kind of what I knew I wanted to do.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you for that. Edward, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I really identify with that, because up until right before the pandemic really hit like crazy, I was working retail. I've just worked retail my entire life, bookstores and grocery stores and stuff. And it came to a point where I had to say, like, this is probably the only moment I'm going to be able to sit down and try and do freelance and struggle against it and see if I can do it. Because the bookstore I was working at that time had just gone out of business. I was massively depressed. The lockdown was just starting in earnest. And, it was a similar, I identify with that very much, kind of a not knowing if you're going to make it, but this is the time, and, going for it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That's great. And we're glad that you did, Trevor. I mean,
Yes.
the art we would have missed out on if you hadn't. But to one more thing I wanted to say was, because I want parents to hear this, especially. You mentioned that it felt like a big risk because I have kids. Yeah, we've got 4 kids, 12 and under. But what I started to tell myself was, how am I ever going to look at them and tell them to go after it if I never did? And so it became a bigger risk to me on an emotional level to not do it, because I really wanted to be that guy to be able to say, kids, you got to go for it. You got to do. And I thought, I've got to set an example. And so for me, the money comes and goes, but And I know that's really flip, but that's ultimately true. But to be able to say you tried is forever, man.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Good point. Edward, go ahead. I know you have a couple questions you wanted to ask.
Yeah, this is for Trevor and for Doug. I was wondering if you guys had a favorite story from Laird's new collection. If there's one that stood out to you as just like the one that blew you away, or the one you were most impressed by, or the one you fell in love with.
It's Tiptoe. I mean, Tiptoe is just, I think, monumental. I love a lot of. I mean, I love that the range of tones and subgenres can so deftly jump. Some from story to story in not a speck of light, but often in the same story. But I'm always going to be partial to the more pure horror stories. I'm such a horror fan, obviously, and I feel like Tiptoe is just like such an incredible horror story that drops these little hints as you go about what's happening, and kind of like draws you in and implicates you in like putting this together until the end. And it ends with like this perfect, horror image that I think about all the time. So getting the chance to illustrate that story alone and not even taking into account any of the other stories was something I was really, really excited about. So it has to be Tiptoe.
How about for you, Doug?
Gosh, probably In a Cavern, in a Canyon. That grief, regret personified as the help me monster was chilling to me. And the confrontation at the end just is something that I can't shake. Of course, I love Tiptoe. I would love to see that in as many different types of media as I possibly could. But the one that has really stuck with me, because of the fuzziness of it all, was the leadoff.
Yes. Well, Laird, what do you think? Tiptoe continues to, just the commentary I see just out on social media is that this is like a top 10 horror story of all time kind of thing. It's people are really, really stuck on, and In a Cavern in a Canyon is not far behind that. I mean, it's also been talked about, and of course, for much longer. What is it about those two stories in particular that you think have gotten such a foothold in the genre reader's imagination?
To my detriment, commercially, I've always, from the very start, I've written sort of offbeat. I mean, horror is a smaller genre, literary genre than some of the others, and obviously, cosmic horror is really painting yourself into a little niche. And but every now and then, like with the Coleridge series, or When Began to Howl, the most recent one, I feel because I grew up reading pulps. I grew up reading a lot of straightforward fiction, and every now and then I just feel the need to write in classical mode. The greats like Ray Bradbury and Stephen King, extremely straightforward. I mean, there's layers, but they put you into a story, and there's a formula to it in a positive way. I mean that. But there's a structure. There's a recognizable structure, right?
Yes.
Homeric kind of structure. And, they don't deviate from that in some of their classic stories. And so I feel Tiptoe and In a Cavern in a Canyon where, I knew it was going to be, because I write in modes that cover a certain time period. So like right now I'm in my dark fantasy mode, and I'd say about 90% of what I'm writing is dark fantasy. When I wrote these stories for Not a Speck of Light, I was sort of in a weird, it was horror, but a weird fiction mode. And so, as a consequence, I knew even before I, had gotten too far into the process, I needed at least a couple anchor type stories for people who have less patience with the oblique. Like, here's a little lifeline. And so, on the surface, those two stories are they're very much me consciously being inspired by Stephen King, Ray Bradbury, classic Matheson, Shirley Jackson, obviously, in the case of Tiptoe. Very, very craftsman-like. and as broadly appealing as possible. Both of them feature younger. There's a frame story in both of them, and both of them, one's a male, one's a female, but they're adolescent or young teens in their respective stories. When you flash back in time, and
That's right. That's right.
that was all consciously done. A lot of my process is unconscious, but there are linchpins in it that for the unconscious stuff to accrete naturally around. And yeah, that was just me trying to, hey, look, here's a radio ready song.
Yes.
At least my attempt. That was my attempt. And the rest of the stories in there, the vast majority of them are, I let my subconscious guide me, generally speaking.
It's interesting that so much of the appeal of your catalog overall is that there are ties between almost every story that you've made, even if it's like, hey, well, this is in a different world. This is a dark fantasy world, or this is kind of a pulp kind of world here. There's still like the same names, names will show up in both of those worlds, or the kind of the contemporary, our real world with some supernatural paranormal elements. But Tiptoe and In a Cavern don't really, they're very much standalone stories. There's not a whole lot that ties them. Tiptoe, there's a character who's, the protagonist is also referenced in one or two other stories in your catalog, but it's really, they are, interestingly, they are standalone stories. Maybe that helps people get a hold of it and they don't need a whole lot of context for it.
Yes, right. That's a good point. And actually, a lot of the stories in the collection can be considered standalone, even though they all work together. But in the frame of my larger universe, yeah. And those two in particular, they do tie in, but they'll tie in more and more as I continue to write. But right now, they're certainly no experience required.
When you've talked in the past about your collections and how you select stories for them, and the like themes around your collections, like the Imago sequence. I go back and look at that and think it's about the fluidity of time and the human form.
Mhm.
Occultation is about love, doomed relationships, and things like that. When you get up to Not a Speck of Light, what's the theme around this collection?
The theme around this collection is, I think, I wrote a story for Imago Sequence called Parallax. And the idea behind that story is that depending on what frame of reference you have, it's tricky to measure, it's tricky to tell whether an object's moving or stationary. And therefore, you could extrapolate that to almost anything. And this kind of mirrors that, what I was thinking about. And that story is a very different story from the rest of the Imago Sequence stories.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It
sure is.
It's not a horror story, although there's some horror signatures in there, but it's not a horror story. It's a dark fantasy science fiction style story, and it would have fit very well in Not a Speck of Light. And so when I was writing Not a Speck of Light, I wasn't necessarily consciously. This goes back to the idea that some things are intentional and some are just the food of the mind, or the fruits of the mind. But now that I'm looking back on it, I was definitely accessing that. And so this collection, Not a Speck of Light, is, yes, it's horrific. There's definitely just balls out horror stories in it. But to Trevor's earlier point, there's a lot of the stories are weird. They're weird fiction. And I guess if I were to distill this collection down to something pithy, which I really probably shouldn't, but it would probably be no good deed. No good deed goes unpunished. Definitely
Wow.
A fortune cookie answer there.
No, that is a good, that actually is an interesting key to a whole lot of the stories here. That totally makes sense. As you were complete, you've also talked in the past about the intention with which you assemble the stories and the order of the stories and the naming of the collection, etc. You still have some stories that have not been collected. Are there were the choices, the 16 stories that went in this collection, Not a Speck of Light, were they very clear choices, or did you struggle with any of them? Were there any other contenders that you were considering for this collection that ended up not going in?
I probably, not counting the antiquity stories that I had at the time of submitting this to Doug, the final selection, I probably had contemporary horror, I probably had another 8 or 9. I'd have to zero in on that, but
Yeah.
at least half a dozen, if not maybe a couple more. The overall selection was pretty simple. There were 3 or 4 stories in there that I kind of wavered on. But what took the longest for me is I could have submitted this to Doug or whomever 3 or 4 years ago. So I submitted to Doug. It was last year, right? So it could have been, this could have happened at least 3 or 4 years sooner. But I just didn't feel right. And then the longest, but before I actually, sent it out to him for his consideration, my agent actually, I spent probably 6 or 8 months with a complete collection, but I couldn't decide what order to put it in. I couldn't decide the last 3 or 4 stories. And so I did other things. I wrote Wind Began to Howl, got sick and almost kicked it. A lot of stuff happened. But before, while all that other stuff was happening, and every day, literally every day, I brought up the Word doc with the table of contents, and I kept changing it.
Wow.
And I tried it with compartmental, with sections, without sections, different orders of the sections. Oh no, these stories, months and months and months and months.
Wow.
And, I'm pretty. I decide things in the order that they need to be decided. I don't mind letting something sit and ferment, but I'm not usually indecisive. But this was this wasn't. This was more like you just know you just know that it's good, but it could be better. And so I didn't actually end up having to have a dilemma. It was more just I kept like a Rubik's cubing it. And it kept and I tried reading it, letting it sit, and I would bring other stories in and toss a couple out. And there were so many subtle, for me, how it flowed. It took me like I said, 6 or 8 months to get it to the final form that I submitted to Doug.
I would love to hear from. Well, I'm sorry, Trevor. Did you have something you wanted to?
Oh, it occurred to me that I've always remembered that in the afterward, I think in Everything's Eventual, the Stephen King collection, he mentions that he just he got a deck of cards and just assigned each card to a story and then just threw them out, and then that was the order the story was in.
Wow.
So yeah, I guess it different ways of doing it, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, one of the most interesting parts of the collection itself, and Doug and Trevor, I would love to ask your opinion on this. If you just think, hey, this is what it's about. The section headings, of course, there's 16 stories, 4 stories per section. The story segments are Blood Red Samaritans, Wandering Stars. The 4th one is Lake Terror. And then the 3rd one is this enigmatic title, Alan Smithy is Dead. Of course, most folks are familiar with the Alan Smithy kind of trope, but I don't know, Doug or Trevor, did you guys have any thoughts about kind of what that title meant, how it's used to encapsulate these 4 particular stories? Any thoughts on that?
Gosh,
that's a good question. Not anything really fully formed, but I forget the story that. Forgive me, I forget the title. The one where it's a reimagining of Shadow Over Innsmouth, and it's like
Fear Sun. It's Fear Sun.
Yeah, Fear Sun, and it's almost like it's a production, like they're cognizant of being, and then Alan Smithy obviously being an anonymous name for someone taking their name off of a film project or a script. I don't know. I don't have anything fully formed for it, but obviously I can see some parallels and stuff.
Don't Make Me Assume My Ultimate Form feels to me like a 70s grindhouse kind of Femforce 5 kind of film. It really kind of reads cinematically to me. So that Alan Smithy kind of wild cinema elements there, I was kind of heading that direction as well. Doug, do you have any thoughts on that?
I took it as, and maybe this is way too abstract, but Alan Smithy being the anonymous, so credited but non-credited. Well, if the anonymous guy is dead, then it's absolutely unknowable. And so I was thinking that maybe this was Laird's nod to something that's truly unknowable at its core.
Interesting. I love that. Laird, any reactions, any hints you want to give?
Yeah, I talked about this. I was on Daniel Brahm's Night Logic podcast, and he has a really great show. And he asked me about this. He was curious about it, and I said, "Well, I titles are really important to me, and I look to poetry and music for great ideas for titles or how titles can be used to transform something, and they can be used to be an explicit decoder of a story. They can foreshadow and tell you kind of what's going to happen. You can start worrying about it, especially in a horror story. Or they could be something completely subversive, something that subverts the story. Who knows how they're going to interact. One of my favorites, though, is titles of music, for example, or poetry that that don't appear within the poem, that don't seem to have any resonance within the poem. But then, if you look at it more closely, you start looking at it like, okay, how would this fit in the poem? What is it really? What is the subtext here? It's like a key. And so, with that said, these titles, it's just a way for me to cheat a little bit, because not only do you get story titles, but then you get to have compartmental, and you can talk. It's basically it's like what they call a speaking indictment, where you don't want to come out, the prosecutor doesn't want to come out and make the accusation, but will still kind of talk around it and kind of hint at what the main thrust is. And Alan Smithy is Dead kind of does that. It's very playful. Those stories are fairly playful and as dark as they are. Also, it's an homage to Lynch, because I'm a big fan of Lynch, and I feel like the collection owes a lot of debt to Twin Peaks and Inland Empire, and especially Lost Highway. And there's a line in Lost Highway that somebody crackles an intercom and they whisper into it. They go, "Dick Laurent is dead."
Right.
And I'm like,
so
on top of everything else, Alan Smithy is dead. It's just another. It's not directly saying, hey, it's about Lynch. But it's another reason why I left it, because the cadence is similar. Most people won't get it, which I'm happy. That actually overjoys me. But the few people that will get it, the Lynch fan will go, "That sounds." Did he say it? I think I heard that in Lost Highway or something. That's, and it goes back to being playful.
I love it. I love it. And of course, there's one other element of these four that tied these four stories together, and it's not explicit in one of the stories, but Swift to Chase, Don't Make Me Assume My Ultimate Form, and American remake of a Japanese Ghost Story either have Jessica Mace as the protagonist or at least one of the characters in there. Yep. Fear Sun doesn't mention her anywhere, but there is a brunette final girl who is not named, and I'm pretty sure that's Jessica Mace. Do you want to make say anything definitive on that or no?
I'll plead the fifth.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, thank you. Fear Sun is hysterical and dark. Yeah, Swift to Chase, actually, I remember reading it some time ago and thinking it's kind of a wild, almost superhero type story, like this kind of thread of Jessica May superhero type, and yet there's elements to it that tie it pretty closely into other stories that are more in what we think of the real world. Related to Ryoko and Campbell and Beasley and that set, and an American remake of Japanese Ghost Story straight out of a Jessica May story. But anyway, it's a wild collection there. Edward, I think you had a couple questions you wanted to bring up next.
Yeah, Laird, I wanted to ask you. A lot of these stories. Well, I'll interrupt myself. It feels like over the course of your career, you've shifted from a much more like personal micro horror to a much more macro kind of like apocalyptic horror. Like Swift to Chase, it felt like a lot of those stories, there was like an apocalypse just out of reach. And it feels like in these stories, you kind of address, blood in my mouth, soul of me is after the apocalypse. Was that intentional or unintentional, or why did you kind of start shifting more into these like global apocalyptic events?
Things, I feel that things sort of crystallize within me over time. So the the seeds for the apocalyptic type stories, and as you know, kind of getting more into them directly as opposed to hinting at them. It's just like a tumor growing. It starts off as a grain, starts off just as a blip in your blood, your cellular structure. Then it's finally grows into a tumor. And I kind of feel like, in a lot of ways, that's it just took a long time for these stories to gestate. I've been having nightmares, apocalyptic nightmares that are extremely not only do they recur, but they're sometimes sequential, and sometimes even if they repeat, they take the story farther. They're actually narratively coherent. I'd say probably 30% of these apocalypse dreams are narratively coherent, which is an amazing amount to actually make sense, and they carry over. And I've been having them since I was a teenager, so maybe it's getting closer.
I hope you're not the one who can see the future if that's the case.
Well, I wrote a story, it's funny, all my body parts that are missing on me are, it's funny that I've written stories, and now those parts, subsequently those parts have been failing. So we'll see. I need to write a story about a big bag of money conking me out. And
For sure.
I reread Nemesis. I really appreciate Nemesis. It feels like the spiritual successor to Vastation, which we talked about in one of the previous interviews. And they reference this machine, and I think the kid in the story is you. I took a close look at it, and I think you're the kid in the various iterations. But and you don't have to tell us if you don't want, but this kid activates this machine, or the scientists activate the machine. Is that what invites the eminence later? And you kind of described that in the Big Whimper and another place.
It's interesting. I'll take credit for it and say yes, but it's not anything that I was consciously worried about. I leave a lot to my subconscious, even continuity, and I find that it's far more fascinating to do it that way. This overall mosaic effect between all these different stories and these different collections. Some are it is very meticulous continuity, some of the characters and stuff, but a lot of it is just I let it slip. There's slippage, and I find that the image is far more fascinating that way. So this machine derives from a nightmare. That whole a lot of that story comes from the end of the world, how the world comes to pass is from a very narratively coherent nightmare I had about 25 years ago. And the fact that it may or may not be related to the black kaleidoscope, which it's very difficult to tell whether the black kaleidoscope, is it an object? Is it a concept? Is it a mode? Is it an intelligence? Is it all those things? And I'm pretty sure that machine has something to do with the black, is an offshoot or a apparatus of the black kaleidoscope.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Another thing I wanted to ask you, and I'm a real diehard fan of your occultation collection. I mean, just that, for my money, that is some of the best stuff you've done. This one felt a lot like that, in a lot of like the doomed relationships, and just, do you think Not a Speck of Light is most like Swift to Chase? Do you think it's like occultation? Do you think it's more like Beautiful Thing? Is it elements of all of those?
Oh, it's definitely pretty close to Swift to Chase because it's weird. It's contemporary generally. It's less cosmic horror oriented. But you're right. It definitely, because occultation may be my favorite of all my collections. I feel like I've probably written better material since then, but I really thought that was one of my best, an early really good effort. I learned how to write a lot more. That I'd improved my skills over Imago Sequence dramatically, but also it's just timeless. Here we go again. I need to write about more stuff like that because that's the big picture thing. That so many people, whether they like no matter what genre they like, they're into relationships, for example, that pertains to them, speaks to them, and yeah, I feel like that seeped into. Like I went back to that. I hadn't been back to that for a while, but I went back to that explicitly for this collection. And I'm always about updating. What would occultation be like today if I wrote it today?
Yeah, the eponymous story, Not a Speck of Light, and you say this maybe more explicitly than you have in some other stories, but it really felt like, their marriage is failing. They get this dog. The dog's going to save the marriage. But then he says, like, we stayed together forever for better or worse. And then you cycle back to that. It almost seemed like a kind of a salvation equals damnation, or like family and love isn't worth it kind of. And it was pretty heartbreaking, actually. I just read it again and it was heavy.
Yeah, thank you. I think it one of my better stories. I think it'll be one that I look back on years from now and think, wow, you did a good. It's something I'm proud of. It's one of the only original things. It's one of the first original things I worked on when I got out of the hospital too. And yeah, it's I've always thought that there's a couple tropes in horror that kind of I get weary about, and that is, let's kill the dog or the cat to show that the villain's a villain. In other words, it's just, let's fridge this cat, fridge this dog, just to show that Michael Myers or whomever is a bad guy, as if we didn't know. That's one. If you see an animal, that they're there to be tortured and killed, and there's no other purpose. The other one is, I feel like the depiction of, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody. I mean, everybody's just doing their own thing, but when you watch all this stuff over the decades, it wears on you when it repeats so much, and that is the idea that every breakup is an apocalyptic. Actually, they're all apocalyptic potentially, but that they're incendiary. That's either ultra cold and obviously dismissive of each other, or they're War of the Roses style. And the fact of the matter is that you don't see very often, unless you're reading like the New Yorker. You don't see a relationship disintegrating, and yet there's good intentions on both sides, and that all of the barbs are things that if you were a house guest might just go zoop, zoop over your head. And I wanted to portray, and yet there could still be this flicker of love in it, but it's not exaggerated. It's not it's not a Hollywood rom-com or a romance novel kind of thing. It's like, this is just what happens to people. And I think it's extraordinarily painful, and then the idea of the selfishness, of adopting an animal to try to patch that up. And the reason I say selfishness is it wasn't a joint decision. The guy just acted, but the wife contributes in her own ways to the whole thing, and it stands as a mirror story to Stride and Collar, where the guy didn't go after his dog.
Yeah.
He had a chance. Spoilers, everybody. He has a chance. Craven does to go through the portal and at least try. And instead, he flees, and then later on, he basically drinks himself to death. Is essentially kind of the impression you're getting. They, band together and they go, by God, we're going to go to hell. It doesn't matter where we're going. We're going to go wherever it is. And yet the result's the fucking same. There's the same, and maybe even worse, because we don't know where Craven ends up. I could see him in a purgatorial domain, but everybody, they all went and did this. This is why I call it Not a Speck of Light. They do what a Judeo-Christian horror, if you go along that axis, is you could lose, but you did the right thing and all this. We're not left with even that. I wouldn't even give them that shred. They even did the right thing. They're a bunch of narcissists who, at least the husband and the wife were. I think John D is more portrayed as like, I'm a loyal friend and I'm with you guys. I'm gonna protect you. But yeah, the couple, you can read them as heroic, or you can read them like I think of them as flaming assholes.
Well, and Lars admits that he is in there. Finley doesn't, but she's pretty cold to him. But then he's such milquetoast. I can see why she's angry at him. He's not the man he used to be. It's an interesting dynamic there.
Oh yeah, she says that to him. You used to be a guy who would have socked him in the face. I miss that kid, or I miss that guy.
Oh, that was cold. Oh,
Yeah.
that was so cold.
Laird, one more quick thing. I don't want to monopolize this, but the question jumped in my brain. In Not a Speck of Light, the Deborah is the woman, and her husband, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he's like the dead wizard.
Victor.
Yeah, he's like the dead wizard in the hell dimension or whatever.
Yeah.
You reference Old Mr. Moon, which implied to me that it connected to antiquity. Now, I'm not familiar with any of the antiquity stories having like one of these hell dimension worlds, but it seemed like he's an agent of Old Mr. Moon because you said that. And so it really made me think that maybe this connected in some way.
It just might be. I would say that whatever you see of antiquity is like the tip of the blade.
Okay.
There's like, in other words, there's going to be a lot to antiquity. Like my health, prevailing, I'll do it. But there's a lot. So, but I won't say you're wrong. I mean, I kind of think Mr. Moon would be a weird typo or coincidence.
For sure. Along the same, while we're talking about Strident Collar and Not a Speck of Light, there's a lot of talk of not just for Not a Speck of Light, but even the Wind Began to Howl with Roger Barnhill. There's a lot, seems like a lot of genius loci activity in the Hudson Valley. Now, if you were to ask horror cinema, Detroit appears to be the center of all evil. But in your work, there's something about Hudson Valley. Seems like a lot of genius loci there. I have not been to that part of the country. Is there something about this region that you've lived in for a while now that kind of brings the genius loci to mind? Is that just a subject that you enjoy?
I don't know about genius loci, but just general legends, and that's one thing. Since I've been sitting here and I can't really read, I can still listen to podcasts, and I can kind of on YouTube I can run imagery and I can kind of see it and listen to it. So I've been listening to like a lot of folklore, tales of folklore here in the Hudson Valley and just all over New York. So there's that. Even if I didn't have an ulterior motive, this would be a great setting. I mean, the history, goes back thousands of years, but just in modern, colonial history, just all the stuff that's happened in the last couple, 300-400 years. And then you talk about the beliefs of the native tribes and the religion that was brought and the customs that were brought over. There is just, a lot. And there's caves. There's like a lot of natural variety. The ulterior motive, though, for some of the stuff that I'm centering here, is that if you look at the map, you can draw a pretty straight line over to basically the corresponding weird stuff going on in Washington State. Mm-hmm. Close enough. And
wow,
that's kind of a premise. I've mentioned that in a story or two, is that there's like this weird sister, there's Anvil Mountain in New York State, the Black Mountain, and then there's Mystery Mountain. There is actually a real Mystery Mountain in Washington State, but there's one I invented on the Olympic Peninsula, which is completely different. But that you could kind of draw a line across the continent to them. So if you folded the continent, they would, within the framework of my narrative, is that they might even line up a little bit.
So kind of a ley line, I think, is maybe what they call that. Yeah. Oh, wow. No, I hadn't really. Of course, there's a lot of connections to Alaska, a lot of connections to Hudson Valley, New York State in this in the various stories, but I hadn't really made that connection of that idea of a ley line or something like that between them. That's really fascinating. And of course, this story, these two stories do feel like, to me at least, they feel like chapters in a larger story. Are we going to return to are we going to see Victor Infante? His arrival seems imminent at the end of Not a Speck of Light. Are we likely to see these characters again?
You're not going to see a lot of the characters again.
Okay.
Maybe Victor and Deborah, we might be seeing them again, but okay. I don't know if we'll be seeing them. Yeah, here's the thing: the minute I start saying nope, never, and then I immediately get 3 story ideas. So
that's right. Okay, good. Well, we've seeded those ideas in. Last question I have about Not a Speck of Light is: there's a really interesting image in there, and it's with Deborah, the B movie former B movie actress, and she is eating. She has a pear that has a fly traversing its weeping skin, and she picks it up and eats it. There is a scene in the story, the Imago sequence, where Marvin Cortez interviews Mrs. Chin, a former member of a sex cult. And the line is, I sat across from Marvin Cortez. I sat across from her at a small table with a centerpiece of wilted geraniums and a fruit bowl containing a single overripe pear. A fat blue bottle fly crept about the weeping flesh of the pear. Is that just a coincidence, or should we read something in there?
You can read something to that. That was one of the, I had written Not a Speck of Light, and I was in the editing process, and that's where I edit as I go. But I made another pass this time, a couple passes, changing voices, like how people how they speak. Just there's just little, adding a quirk here, taking one out there, that kind of thing. And I tweaked that scene because the scene was slightly different, and I realized what I wanted to do. I wanted it to mirror the Mrs. Chin from the Imago sequence, where she had her little suite at the asylum, and the conversation that she had. And it's all about what shall I say? There's a through line that's basically repeating, like time repeating, circular, but everything else is sort of oppositional. And Not a Speck of Light, you have kind of a guy wouldn't step on a fly, versus in the Imago sequence, the lone interviewer is a thug who could snap your neck. The woman in Imago sequence, as I recall, she was like, almost, she had anorexia essentially. This lady is voluptuous.
Yes.
On and on. Just little things like that. And then of course the pear it was there for most people just to simply go, yeah, whatever. It's atmosphere. But I figured sooner or later a perceptive fan of mine is going to go, wait a minute.
There's something about weeping skin on a pear that really sets me off, I guess. So it's, I was like, there's a fly on a pear. Hold on a second. So I had to go look that up. Okay, awesome. Good. Let's see, we're going to wrap this up in about 17 minutes, keep it at 90 minutes. And I think I've asked all the burning questions that I've got. A couple of things that I want to, just like a couple of just for fun questions I'd like to bring up to the group. Edward, were there any other topics that you wanted to hit? And I think we've got maybe one other question from the comments that I'll ask as well. But Edward, go ahead.
Yeah, I have two. And Laird, we've talked about this, but I'm curious. So are we going to see more of Rex? Rex is in Soul of Me, and Rex shows up in 4 stories, and then Secondus Rex is in Eyes Like Evil Prisms. Are there plans for Rex? Can we read more Rex?
Definitely Secundus Rex, and or the various Clockwork Rexes. You're going to see more of them. Matter of fact, I have a couple of stories that already sketched out that they I don't know if we'll see any more from his perspective. I won't say never, but he'll definitely have starring roles in some stories that I have planned.
Nice.
The other thing I was going to ask you, and so you've announced, and I think this is probably with Doug, this 2 riders, huge double omnibus kind of table of contents was on your Patreon. It felt a lot to me like when you announced that, Not a Speck of Light kind of was like taking Swift to chase, doing what you wanted with that mythology, and then setting it down. And you often talk about the bridge, right? The bridge to the later collections. And so when you made the announcement, this really felt like the bridge to that. Was that intentional, or was that happenstance? As soon as you announced it, I was like, wow, that's incredible. But I don't know if it was on purpose.
No, there was some intentionality there.
Okay.
I feel like actually a couple of the stories in Not a Speck of Light serve as bridge stories into antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I think the title story, because the title story is not really a weird fiction story or a horror story. I mean, it has elements of both. It's a dark fantasy. It's a contemporary fantasy, I would say. Even has a sword wielding, warrior. It has a wizard. It has all that stuff. So it's all intentional. Every time I do a collection, I have right from the beginning. I've always tried to have one story somewhere in there that signals what the next collection is going to be like.
You know, if you had one more character and not a speck of light, you almost have Scooby-Doo, kind of a really inverted evil Scooby-Doo, because you got the dog, you got the scaredy cat guy, tough girl woman. I guess that would be Daphne or whatever. And then the nice guy friend there, who I kind of pictured as John Langan. I don't know if I'm off base there, but I know you've snuck in some other horror authors in some of your work. But
I don't mind. I don't mind revealing it. Everybody in the story is a mirror of myself, people that I know, and John. Like you've got Paul Wooster, that's Paul Tremblay.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. John Deed, Langan. I mean, it's not them for legal purposes, but
Right.
it's mostly coincidental, but not 100%.
Did you have a particular? You may not even want to answer this question, but for the Deborah Infante, was there a particular kind of movie star actress that you had in mind when you wrote her character? And she's a fascinating character, a pretty duplicitous one, but also just so voluptuous, and the accent. I mean, she sounds like a Southern belle, is the way I'm reading it, or heavily accented anyway.
There was nobody specific as far as her build, just general terms, but her attitude, her demeanor is somebody that that I know. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Very good. Understood. Let me see. I will ask one of our Redditors on the Laird Barron subreddit. This is Wake Winslow. Posted a question recently that I just thought was a fun question, and I'd love to hear from all of you what your choices would be. You're a studio exec heading a 3-episode miniseries based on Laird's short fiction. Which 3 stories do you choose to adapt, and in what order do you present them? And if you have any thoughts on directors, casting choices, etc. And he had his 3 episodes: In a Cavern in a Canyon, directed by Jennifer Kent; The Men from Porlock, directed by Robert Eggers; and The Imago Sequence, directed by David Bruckner. So he went all out and gave us the directors as well. I'd love to hear if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I mean, mine are, he nailed 2 of mine already. I would do, because it means so much to me, Blackwood's Baby, In a Cavern in a Canyon, and Tiptoe. Directors off the top of my head, I would love to see David Pryor do probably Blackwood's Baby, maybe. I don't know for the other 2, though. I'd have to think on that more. But definitely those 3 stories. Yeah.
Awesome. Doug, how about you? Would you have the 3 stories that you would pick?
Gosh, In a Cavern in a Canyon, for sure. I like Joran Falls, just because it's so. I think it gives you enough visually to work with, but not so much to take the mystery out of. And then, very selfishly, Laird's newest versus
yes,
from Long Division, and the only one that I see handling that one properly is Josh Rubin, director of Werewolves Within. I think that he could do just a bang up job on the sort of like creepy, antagonistic, R-rated Addams Family vibe that has.
I haven't read it yet. I just got like the digital download as one of the from the pre-order here, and I'm so excited to read this. I have read its predecessor called Sundown, and I totally see what you mean with Josh Rubin as a director. I'm a big Josh Rubin fan, and and folks, if you haven't gotten Long Division, if you haven't ordered that, go ahead and grab a copy of this. It's got an incredible table of contents here, incredible author collection. Very excited about this, and obviously quite relevant as well. Laird, who would you what 3 stories would you want to divvy out in directors? You may not be able to say, because you might have some of these in play actually right now. I don't know.
So Easy to Kill, which is a science fiction horror story.
Interesting. Who would you have direct that?
Probably Refn,
yeah.
And the Broadsword, Panos Cosmatos.
Oh
Mm.
yes.
And
Yeah.
then probably like say Bulldozer by Takashi Miike.
Oh
Nice.
my goodness, that's amazing. Okay, wow. I'm having to reconsider all of my direction on this. But Edward, do you have three you want to mention?
I don't know if I have three. I was thinking about hallucinogenia, and I don't know if it would be
Yeah.
too weird if Yorgos Lanthimos, like, I think that would be a cool, like a Baron story in a Yorgos film. I mean, they did the movie for 30 already, which I'm a huge fan of.
Yeah.
I like Catch Hell. I mean, if I think Catch Hell would make an awesome film. And then I probably would pick one of the ones from this one, like my favorite newest story, because I read 5 of them before this came out, but The Blood in My Mouth, I think would make an amazing film, because that was like the
Oh, yeah.
infinite love story at the end. And so maybe those 3, or maybe a smattering of that kind of word salad.
Nice. I love that. Harrison suggests Imago sequence directed by Damien Rugna. Anything directed by Damien Rugna, I'm good with. He's incredible.
Yeah.
Of course, we know him
Yeah.
from Terrified and When Evil Lurks, and he had a story in the about Rubik's cubes. When my son's a Rubik's cube speed solver, and that was in the Satanic Hispanics anthology. But Damien's absolutely incredible, terrifying director. I could go for anything directed by him. I would probably stick with some. Try to build momentum with Old Leech stories. So I'd probably do definitely Men from Porlock, Mysterium Tremendum, and then probably the Broadsword. But that third one would be I'm not sure which one I would choose there. Probably Broadsword. But yeah. And directors, Damon Rugna would be. Oh, no, you know what? No, actually, Imago sequence, because I love the story so much, especially the final image. I think Imago sequence I would probably do. And Damien would be a great choice for that. I'm a big fan of Osgood Perkins as well. I'd probably try to find a match for him. But Panos or Panos is awesome. Love his work. I'd have to think about the directors there.
Ari Aster could do like the weird, like Joran Falls, or like the weird family drama ones. Like he would do a creepy something, you know.
Absolutely, that's a great choice there too. As we wind down, I did want a couple other questions real quick that we got from online here from YouTube Live. Laird, any chance of the Lonely Dead of the Jack Herringa story? Any chance of that showing up on your Patreon at some point?
Oh, that's a good thought. Yeah.
Because it's not available. You cannot get that book anywhere. And for those completists like me, that is a hard piece to find. So that got a request for that.
Yeah, I think maybe it will. I ended up actually, you've seen it if you've read the Croning, because there's a chapter in the Croning that I actually just altered that Jack Herringa story and put it in there as a scene, because it was going to be a scene from the original Croning novel, which took me years to write. So, but I end up using that for Jack Herringa's, death scene, but then I repurposed it back into the novel. So, but I think I might do that. I might, if I can find the original version, I have to find it. But if I can, I think I will put it up.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you. I think that'd be, while we're on the subject, there's a lot going on your Patreon right now. I love, we mentioned this, I think, the last call. I love that you're actually doing some audio recordings of some of your posts, and love to hear your reminiscences, your reviews of authors, and even some short pieces, some poetry and short pieces in your own voice. I just love that. What else do you have planned maybe coming up over the next few weeks, next few months for your Patreon?
Oh, it's probably, more of the same in general. I'm going to talk about what I'm reading, what I'm watching, what's going on, and maybe reminisce about a few things from my past. And at the highest tiers, I'm going to be continuing. I just have to I have to do recordings when I can see well enough to read the script. But
Yes,
I'm working on, and this is probably a 2-year project, I would think, if I do it every 5 days or so. I'm releasing story notes on every story I've ever had published.
Wow.
And that's going to also be, the novels, the Coleridge novels. Any standalone novels will be. I'll talk about those, and then not only will I talk about every story, so let's say there's 80 stories, so that'll be at least a couple, year and a half, 2 years. I'll be working on that, so you'll be getting a steady dose of them. Because I'd like to do them like at least one, a couple a week maybe. But
Yes.
but I'm also going to talk. I'll do a separate post for each of the actual collections as a whole. So there'll be a lot of, some will be short entries, and I might even write an essay or two. But it's just going to be author notes. I'm not somebody that normally has ever done author notes, but I realize that my resistance to them is more. I just don't really want them as outtakes in my book. But I think having them separate, like you can go somewhere else and read what my mindset was when I was writing these different stories. Because that's mostly what they're going to be about. They're not really going to be the keys to interpreting a story. It'll be mostly like, I was broke and I sold out on this one. That'll be more what and then I bought a bunch of booze. That'll be more what these notes are like.
Nice. Well, I do love that your Patreon is really becoming an archive of a lot of stories that are very hard to find. You have reprints of those, and your thoughts and your readers' thoughts on your work. So that's kind of an archive that will be also a reader's companion to your work. So I love that material's being captured there.
It's going great and really well supported by my patrons, and I really appreciate them.
Absolutely, and if folks, if you aren't on Laird's Patreon, you can go and just subscribe to it for free and get at least monthly updates, and I think a few other bits and pieces.
More than
here
that,
and there.
I try to at least once a week put something up that's available to everybody. Yeah,
but. Join the Patreon. Patreon's a great way to directly support Laird in his work. Go and buying his books, obviously. Buy them from Bad Hand. I'm such a fan of Bad Hand. I have a Bad Hand shelf of just authors that I'm not even all that familiar with, but Bad Hand published them, and I've got a growing shelf. I got a couple more I have to collect to have a full shelf there. These are great ways to support Laird, support Doug, because his publishing company, seriously, like, he says it's a baby publishing, indie baby publishing company, but Bad Hand has set the bar very high, especially, and this is just my opinion here, but especially with how he takes care of Laird and his authors, and Not a Speck of Light is a work of art. It is beautifully designed, powerfully illustrated, and the fiction, of course, these are stories we love by Laird. So go and or get those books, share them with your friends. I have horror community champion friends who they'll just go and buy up credits on Amazon for a Kindle for copies of a book, a Kindle version of a book by an author they love, and they'll just say DM me for a code. They just want to share these stories out, and I think that is a great way to support your authors. And Doug, I think that I saw some hints out on socials from you that there might be some thinking around a hardcover edition of Not a Speck of Light, and I would personally be thrilled because I'm a collector. I love that stuff. Anything that you can share with us right now? Any hints that you can give us?
I heard things, Greg. No, yeah, that is something that it is not necessarily official at this point, but I can tell you that there is a lot of intention around it. There are discussions happening, and if those things come to fruition, there would be a nice big trim hardcover, specialty hardcover. With the possibility of brand new artwork, possibly from Mr. Trevor, who is sitting here. So there would be if this hypothetical comes to fruition, there would be plenty of exclusive content and reasons for folks to buy this as a genuine collector's item. So I would, if one were so inclined, I would encourage everybody just to keep their ear to the ground on this.
Follow Bad Hand Books, follow them on socials, sign up for the Bad Hand newsletter, which has a wealth of wealth of information on Laird's work with Bad Hand and other really terrific, I mean, like some really top-notch authors, people that we follow, Sarah Reed, Clay McLeod Chapman, I know Eric LaRocca, and other folks are and doing work with Mike Mignola, and I can't pronounce Tom's last name.
Snigoski. Yeah.
Snigoski, thank you.
We've got more coming from Mike and Chris Golden as well.
Yes.
And right now we're kind of importing the Mignola-verse, parts of it anyway, to Bad Hand Books. But going forward, there will be new stuff happening with Mike and with Tom and possibly with Chris as well. So.
And I gotta say, if this hardcover of Not a Speck of Light were to come to pass with new Trevor art, I would first flip out over it and buy multiple copies. And second, I would love to just see how Trevor approaches, like, how would you re-illustrate these stories? So because I'm kind of looking at the art as it is now. I'm trying to trace like they're not all the villains or monsters of the stories. So like, what approach would you take? So I can't wait to see that. And Trevor, I mean, I know we all know you as a celebrated horror illustrator, but you're also a very seasoned kind of horror culture consumer, and in particular, like, you have seen so many horror films. It's insane. Do you have any idea how many horror movies you've actually watched over your lifetime?
Oh my God. I don't know. I put him on the spot right now. I'm not sure. I've seen a lot of horror movies. I love horror movies. Yeah. Since I was a kid, my dad got me on it. So I've just been, I try and watch something new and hope that I can hopefully shout about like at least a couple times a week.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I love that. I think recently on socials, you've posted like, here's like 150 great horror movies, and some of them were like real. I'd not heard of them before. So
Good.
Definitely, I encourage everyone follow Slimy Swamp Ghost on social media, because not just for the creepy pictures, which are awesome, but also just your wealth of knowledge on horror cinema is so wonderful. And you actually have like plushies of little creatures you've created. I think little Nugget, I think is one of them. Yeah. So
that's coming soon. Yeah.
Great stuff out there. Well, thank you guys so much for joining. I'm going to close with this. This is a little 2-line statement, 2 or 3-line statement that Laird wrote in his afterword about Not a Speck of Light. And he says, I'm just going to quote him here. "For me, every collection is a battle fought in a war of attrition that we all lose in the end. Our best hope is to leave something of ourselves behind, a token of the joy, suffering, and turmoil that make up a life. Literature is my gesture against the dark." And man, that's it. I think you nailed it with that. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Thanks to everyone who joined us for the live webcast and who will watch this afterward. And Laird, we are excited to read more of your work heading forward into 2025. Doug and Trevor and Laird, let us know what we can do to support you. And if you're not already on the Laird Barron subreddit, there's the link for it. Edward, do you want to say anything about continuing in 2025? The read-along is kind of wrapping up, but in a way it's going to continue.
Yeah, and you guys referenced Chicken, who is taking on this Herculean task of he really wants to write up all of Laird's work, and so I think he's going to do most of that. I'm going to do probably 1 or 2. I have 1 in the works already, so I just think that he didn't want to leave the stuff we hadn't covered uncovered, so it's going to continue in a loose format going forward. Yes.
So we'll have write-ups on more of Laird's stories in 2025. But we're looking forward next to having John Langan is doing a write-up on Tiptoe. That will be posted in the next couple of days, I think, and then I'll wrap things up around Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, with the final story, "You Won't Be Saved by the Ghost of Your Old Dog." So anyway, again, thank you guys for joining us. Great to see you again, and we will talk to you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.